Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Center's Deputy Director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion, which will feature a short talk by Jenny Schuetz and comments by Christian Dorsey. Before I introduce Jenny and Christian, I want to make sure that you know that next Thursday night, the Joint Center is going to kick off a two-day symposium called Bringing Digitalization Home: How Can Technology Address Housing Challenges? We'll begin at 6:30 on Thursday with a keynote lecture on designing AI ethics in practice and in public. That'll be delivered by Molly Wright-Steenson, a professor of ethics and computational technology at Carnegie Mellon University. Molly's also the author of the terrific book, Architectural Intelligence: How Designers and Architects Created the Digital Landscape. Indeed, the landscape that we're going to be discussing over the next 2 days on Friday and half of Saturday, in a series of panel discussions that not only will examine how digitalization, notably big data and advanced analytics, has changed and is changing all aspects of housing, but also will assess whether those changes are helping or could help address efforts to address a variety of important housing-related challenges, such as affordability, inequality, segregation, and climate change. The symposium will be a hybrid event. In keeping with current university policies, the in-person portion, which will be at the Graduate School of Design, currently is open only to Harvard students, faculty, and staff. More information about the symposium and other upcoming Joint Center events is available on our website, www.jchs.harvard.edu. Now on to today's presentation. I've known Jenny Schuetz since the early 2000s, when she carried out some seminal work on land use regulation in Greater Boston, not only zoning, but all of the other ways that we control land uses. She did that work with funding from a variety of entities, including the Joint Center, which awarded her a Meyer Dissertation Fellowship. Jenny is now a Senior Fellow at Brookings Metro, and she's the author of Fixer Upper: How to Repair America's Broken Housing Systems, an important new book that came out last month. Given the ambitious agenda that Jenny will lay out in her discussion, in a brief presentation, which will give you an overview of the argument in the book, we wanted to make sure that we had an elected official concerned about housing as part of the conversation. And fortunately, we were able to persuade Christian Dorsey to take on that task. Christian is vice chair of the Arlington, Virginia County Board, and also chair of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. Jenny's going to take about 10 or 15 minutes to give us an overview of the book's key ideas and proposals. I'll then bring Christian into the conversation, which will start with some questions from me, but will evolve into a discussion informed by questions that you'll be posting via Zoom's Q&A feature. Apologies in advance if we don't get to your questions. As you can see, there's enormous interest in this topic and in this book. A video of Jenny's talk, the discussion, and Jenny's slides will be posted on the Center's website by early next week. Jenny, it's all yours.
Thank you for that kind introduction, David. I'm going to bring up some slides to share with you. So thank you to David and to the team of the Joint Center for inviting me to join you. It's always a pleasure to be back, at least virtually, at the Joint Center and to engage with other people who are interested in housing. So the broad framing for starting off on this book is really a fairly simple fact that even before the COVID-19 pandemic struck, the US hasn't been building enough housing to keep up with the demand based on population and job growth. So if we look at just the overall levels of housing production over the last several decades, we can see that this has actually been slowing down. And since the Great Recession, roughly for about 10 years now, the US nationally hasn't built enough homes to keep up with population growth. But the problem is even worse in high demand places, the places with particularly strong labor markets where a lot of people want to live and work. So if we think about places like most of California, the greater Boston area, New York City, they haven't been building enough homes for nearly 30 years, either at the entire metro area or particularly close to jobs and transit in communities with lots of amenities where most people want to live. The reason we haven't been building enough housing is not because we can't find enough construction workers or import construction materials. It really goes back to the process we have for approving housing and land use. So we have an entire set of policies, starting with things like zoning code, that make it difficult to build more housing, particularly in high demand locations. Most of the land in both our cities and our suburbs only allows single family detached homes to be built. So these are the largest and most expensive type of homes. And many of the neighborhoods where people would like to move to today are essentially already built out in single family homes. So it's illegal to add any more housing and allow more people to move in. Zoning is one of the most obvious ways in which local governments restrict development of new housing, but there are a variety of other tools as well. Things like large minimum lot sizes, historic preservation, even environmental regulations can be used to block new housing, particularly in these high demand communities. The other part of this, besides the rules that are written on the ground, is the political process that's necessary to approve new housing. Local governments have essentially outsourced a lot of the decisions over new development to their existing residents. Now, we can understand that people care about their neighborhoods, they're attached to them, and they want to have a voice in what happens to their neighborhood. Building more housing can add more people. It may bring in more kids into schools and create additional traffic. But giving existing residents, and particularly long-term homeowners, veto power over new development has some serious economic costs, environmental costs, and social costs for people who would like to live in those communities, but don't have the voice to show up and move there. A related problem that's not entirely the same is the affordability issue for poor households. So everywhere in the US, the poorest 20% of households can't afford market rate housing without some additional subsidy. Roughly 10 million renter households spend more than half of their income every month on housing, which leaves them too little left over to pay for food and healthcare and clothing and transportation and other necessities. Now, this isn't just a problem for poor families, it's a problem for all of us. Millions of families with kids are living in poor quality housing or unsafe and unhealthy neighborhoods in families with high levels of financial stress. If the US wants to have a healthy, well-educated, productive workforce 20 years from now, we need to invest in higher quality living environments for all children today. Because many of the land use restrictions, such as bans on apartments, focus on the lowest income housing, these also serve as ways to essentially gatekeep low-income households from living in high opportunity communities, reinforcing existing patterns of economic and racial segregation. The flip side of our broken housing system, besides not building enough homes in the right places, is that we build too many homes in the wrong places, environmentally speaking. So very often low-income workers can't afford to live in downtown locations close to their jobs or close to public transportation. Those low-income workers don't just disappear, they go in search of cheaper housing, which they can find at the outskirts of our major metropolitan areas. So we have low-income workers who are often driving 2 hours to commute to work. This obviously creates then more driving, more traffic congestion, more greenhouse gas emissions, and regional damage that affects not just those low-income workers with long commutes, but the entire region and the country. The other problem with not having built enough housing close into jobs is that we are essentially pushing more homes and more people into areas at high risk of climate damage. So certainly much of the West, California, Colorado, we are seeing bigger damages from events like wildfires and hurricanes because we are building more homes in those risky areas. And many of those are homes that would be built closer in areas with lower risk if they were allowed to be built there. The US relies very heavily on homeownership as the primary mechanism for household wealth building. Subsidies that are built into the federal tax code, like the mortgage interest deduction, encourage homeowners to use home equity as their primary form of saving up wealth. This has a couple of downsides, however. Black households in particular have been excluded from homeownership for generations through legal mechanisms, redlining, and restricted access to credit. Latino families also have had more difficulty getting access to homeownership. Both Black and Latino homeowners, when they buy homes, are also less likely to build as much home equity. So we can see from this chart that even among homeowners, white households have roughly twice the value of home equity as Black households. Closing the racial wealth gap will involve moving away from solely relying on homeownership and more direct means of income redistribution. Policies such as, for instance, baby bonds, where the federal government would provide cash transfers to households that particularly benefits low wealth families. The other downside of relying so heavily on homeownership to build wealth is that it makes homeowners very protective of the equity that they have built up. So homeowners are often reluctant to allow things like low-income housing in their neighborhood because they worry about the impact on their property values and therefore on their assets. If we gave people other venues to build wealth, this might reduce some of the reluctance to allow low and moderate income housing in some of the high opportunity communities. We also have to think about the ways that we rely on, that we fund our local our services, such as schools, roads, and parks. Local governments rely very heavily on property taxes, which of course depend on the value of homes in their community. Many local governments are reluctant to allow small, moderately priced rental housing to be developed because they worry that this will cost them more in the value of services they provide than it brings in through property tax revenues. This is not entirely consistent with the data, but it's a deeply held belief by many local governments that winds up distorting our housing markets and preventing low-income housing from being built in many of our communities. Regional revenue sharing and cost sharing across local governments within a region could help remove some of these distortions to limit rental properties, and it could also equalize the quality of public services across wealthy and poor jurisdictions. In order to correct all of these problems, we're going to need systemic policy changes at every level of government. Local governments, who are the ones who primarily set the rules governing housing production, need to reform those with a focus on allowing a greater diversity of housing types, not just single family detached, but townhouses and apartment buildings, and allowing different sizes of properties that would be available at a wider price range to accommodate a broader set of workers and incomes. State governments play several important roles in allocating local governments both their fiscal authority and setting out the kinds of authority they have over land use regulation. State governments could play an important role in creating financial carrots and sticks that encourage localities to adopt these pro-housing reforms and to build more housing in the places where it's needed. The federal government, which has the broadest kind of fiscal flexibility, is the only one that can really provide adequate financial support for low-income households. So an important message for the federal government is to simply provide more money to poor households so that they're able to afford decent quality housing in safe neighborhoods without putting in danger other kinds of consumption. The federal government could also use the tax code more judiciously rather than providing large subsidies to wealthy homeowners who have already bought their homes to encourage first-time homeownership by lower income households. None of the policy ideas in my book are original to me. Many of these have been proposed by other researchers and advocates, in some cases going back decades. It's not that we don't know the good policy ideas, but we get stymied every time by the wicked hard politics. People who benefit from the current status quo, which includes a lot of middle and upper income homeowners, are reluctant to allow changes in policy, changes in their neighborhood that they feel may threaten their well-being. The people who have the most to gain from policy changes, primarily younger households and renter households, are less engaged in politics, especially at the local level. They're underrepresented among local governments, often face challenges to participating in the political process, and haven't yet built the kinds of durable political coalitions that will allow them to push for these policy changes. With that sort of pessimistic view, I think there is cause for optimism. There's more attention to the problem of housing unaffordability and housing shortage than we've ever seen. A number of state and local governments have made legislative progress in the last several years, everything from Minneapolis legalizing duplexes and triplexes citywide, similar kind of statewide policy in Oregon. And we're seeing interesting movements in this direction from a number of unusual states, including North Carolina and Utah, that are expressing more interest in the state taking an active role in regulating housing production to encourage more competitive business environment. So I wrote the book in part to engage more people in the conversation beyond the sort of committed pro-housing advocates who are already working on the ground and people who are convinced that more housing is a bad thing. There's a wide swath of the population that's just not that engaged in this issue yet. And one of the things I would like to do is to convince sort of the median suburban homeowner that in fact, these are national problems, but also problems for them personally. Our regional economies function better when workers at all income levels can live near their jobs. If we want to make progress on climate change, we're going to have to embrace more climate-friendly patterns of housing and stop building in the wrong places. And we all have an incentive in investing in children, the future workers and citizens, and making sure that they have decent living environments and access to high-quality public schools. So my hope is that when people read this, they realize this is an important issue and they're more engaged, more willing to engage with their local government. There's a broad set of policy recommendations that I hope people will look at and consider. And these are really intended not just to shake up the kind of the winners and losers, but to also to convince people that we can broadly build more equitable, more resilient, and more prosperous communities. Thank you for giving me a chance to join you, and I look forward to Christian's response.
There's just an enormous amount to unpack here. Christian, you've been on the front lines of some of this. You've been a county supervisor, or on the county board, excuse me, since I believe 2015. One of the assertions Jenny makes, I think something that struck all of us, is that this is wicked hard politics. I think you'll agree. I probably, being in Massachusetts, say wicked had politics. I had to do that. But there are signs of progress, and I'm wondering, you know, as the only one of the three of us who has to go before voters periodically, are you seeing real signs of progress in Arlington County and in the Metro Washington region, and where are the places where we haven't yet seen those signs of progress?
Well, thank you, David. And before I actually answer your specific question, I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to not first thank you for the invitation to provide comments on Jenny's book and the themes that she presented today. And Jenny, I want to thank you for the work. Truly a fantastic contribution to both the policy community who cares about housing, but as you described, and as people who read the book will find, it is quite accessible for people without the policy background to absorb the central themes. And for all of you who are attending this afternoon, just to orient you to what informs my thinking, Arlington, Virginia is the nearest Virginia suburb to Washington, D.C., part of the urban core of the National Capital Region. And while technically described in all manners as a suburb, we are 80% as dense as the capital city itself. So we are quite an anomaly in the world, something that functions much more like a city than a suburb. And as part of the work, as David introduced in the beginning, I also chair our regional organization of the 24 jurisdictions that surround Washington, D.C. And in many ways, we have the characteristics of a regional overlay to local governance, because the ease of mobility that people have to live, work, and play throughout the area really renders distinctions between local, state, or in our case, district governments a little less meaningful than they are in other parts of the country. So with that as background, to answer your specific question, David, you know, things are not going to sort of change evolutionarily. They have to be intentionally moved towards change. And fortunately, I'm a part of a region where people are, really getting the primacy of addressing our housing challenges in a way that may be different than what has been the past paradigm of just letting nature take its course. And principally to deal with the wicked hard political issues there is a need to directly engage with what is driving the resistance that we all get from our constituents. Now, Jenny outlined that we have stakeholder groups that have somewhat of a vested interest or perspective that is resistant to this kind of change. And typically that has just crippled public officials from even going there. Almost like, the federal government, we have Social Security as the third rail of politics, and local communities, it's really housing and density. People don't want to go there for both the express threat that people who are resistant will offer. I'm a high contributing taxpayer. You need to listen to what I say and be responsive to what I direct you to do. Or to the socialization that we have in our communities, that density is a bad thing. More means less, more for others means less for me. And then you also have the implicit biases that people hold that may have them resistant to newcomers for fear or concern about what those newcomers will look like and what they will bring to the community culturally. So given all of those really difficult, wicked challenges, people have just tended to take the path of least resistance. However, if you want change, you've got to force it, and you've got to engage people where they are. And so some of the successes in moving the dial that I've been able to see are, one, to not respond to those people with the assumption that they are retrograde NIMBYs who just need to be enlightened in order to get with the modern progressive program, but to instead offer them a little bit of grace with engagement and really find out what's driving that resistance. And through that process of engagement and inquiry, you find a couple of things. People sometimes are resistant to change because, you know what? Here's a big secret. Everybody should write this down. They like the communities that they live in. And when people like things, and there are others who come with an agenda of, we're going to bring needed change, there is a fear that that change will not be reflective of what they will continue to like and value. So one, there is a need to actually be fully expressive of how this change, as Jenny mentioned, not only makes room and accommodates newcomers and addresses our housing challenges, but it also brings commensurate benefits that they care about, whether it be sustainability and climate change, diverse opportunities for their children to learn in public schools, opportunities to walk or have easier access to retail and restaurants, urban village concepts that are even very popular in suburban communities. So we must engage people on that level. There's also something that I hear all the time. People are concerned very much that if we go and do this route, I am going to have to pay, me, an extant homeowner, I'm going to have to pay to provide the infrastructure that's currently lacking to accommodate those folks. So there's a fundamental feeling of fairness that they think is lacking, where they're going to have to contribute, where the benefits are going to accrue to others. And so one of the things that you can do to get around that is by making infrastructure investment to accommodate demand and growth part of your regular program, not just something that you want to attach to a pro-housing policy initiative, but the regular business that you do in order to keep communities functioning well. And so I'll just sum up to say that one of the ways in which change is possible in the right direction, as Jenny advises, is to make sure that your local government is, one, engaging, not walking away for fear that the third rail is going to spark them, and to really be responsive to the things that people do really care about. Because, Jenny, I don't know if you mentioned it, I don't think you mentioned it here, but one of the fascinating parts about this debate, it doesn't fall along lines of people who are progressive or conservative. You can have the most ardent progressives who want to fight for climate change and increase diversity, who will nonetheless say, well, all of those policies are well and good everywhere else, just not where I live. So Anyway, I'd love to talk more about this, and I hope I didn't take up too much time with that initial response.
No, this is terrific. And Jenny, actually, you talk in the book, you touched on this briefly, but I wonder if you can expand on it, on what Christian was just sort of talking about, which is the nature of these coalitions that have sort of moved the needle. And you also identify in the book a couple of very specific policies, at least at the local level. I think there were three kind of general buckets that you talked about that seem to have emerged. So can you sort of walk us through what, let's arguably say, that what does the new politics of housing potentially look like?
Yeah, so I should say it varies a little bit from state to and city where they've put together successful coalitions. But you can think of kind of three broad arguments in favor of building more housing and particularly allowing smaller, denser housing. One is very much a pro-business competitiveness argument, building more homes, allowing more people to live in places with good jobs is good for growth, right? So this allows firms to attract and retain good workers. It allows more people to live in these really innovative and productive places. So this is a pro-growth argument, which resonates well with traditional kind of Republicans and pro-business conservatives. One of the other arguments is clearly that this is beneficial for the climate, that building more homes in places that already have jobs in transit that are relatively dense and smaller homes that use less energy, that this is good for the climate and sort of the long run take we need to do. And then third, there's definitely a racial equity component of this, opening up high opportunity communities to lower income households who are more likely to be Black and Latino, rectifies some of the discrimination that we've had in the past, right? And we know from lots of evidence that many of these kind of low density policies, bans on apartments, large minimum lot sizes, these were originally enacted in part to enforce racial segregation. Even if that's not the intent today, changing those can correct some of these past discrimination. So these are some arguments that resonate somewhere with Republican audiences, somewhere with Democratic audiences. Places like Oregon that have built statewide coalitions, they have a mixture of traditional affordable housing advocates, climate groups, the real estate industry, building trades unions, right? Building more houses is great for carpenters and electricians. Many of the sort of advocacy groups that are concerned about the lack of economic opportunity, some of the pro-immigrant groups, because immigrants tend to benefit very much from more housing in high opportunity communities. So they've built some of these coalitions across different factions, which maybe find different parts of the policies motivating. But I will say that this is a long process. Oregon spent several years building together the coalition, working on the specific policy proposals. They actually paired a statewide zoning reform with a form of rent regulation and tenant protections to be able to say, look, more development in low-income neighborhoods doesn't have to result in displacement. We can provide protections for people who already live there. And thinking very much about the homeowners and renters who live in those neighborhoods who don't have a lot of resources, making sure that this is not going to primarily impact them, right? A statewide or a citywide rezoning that makes it easier to build in wealthy white communities is also one of the best defenses against displacement in low-income Black and brown neighborhoods. And I think that's an argument that's worth making and making over again.
Christian, I want to pick up a little bit on some of the politics. I'd be curious. I know that Arlington, Jenny's been involved in an update of your master housing plan. So if you're seeing that politics, but I was also among some of the interesting ideas that Jenny threw out there. One is a larger role for the state, and I'm wondering how that looks in 2022 in Arlington County, and whether I'm going to suspect that might be different than the way it looked in 2021.
Yeah.
But just sort of, in general, your sense of whether or not there might be some traction for that. And then also, Jenny, you have a very provocative idea of relying on things like the COGS, the council, sort of the regional councils of governments or MPOs, to distribute some of the housing money, much in the way that they get to distribute some of the transportation money. And Christian, this is going to be sort of interesting because you've got to put on both your local and your regional hat. I'm wondering, so one, would you like to see the state do more of what Jenny was talking about, and what do you see as the up and down of that, and the other similarly for the COG?
Yeah, it's a great question and a great point. You know, part of the issue that has made housing difficult to have effective change, as Jenny notes, it takes time. It's not something that you can do within the course of a year-long initiative or even a term of office. And one of the things that's just a fact and a reality about politics, people who are charged with making these decisions, is that leadership will change. And it is very easy for people to organize to outlast what might be the will of a particular body that's in charge of making the decisions. And if they are in fact successful in getting a different vision, a different style of leadership, well, then you've got to start all over again in future times. So the political nature of the involvement is perilous. And I know Jenny informs that to look beyond localism as potential solutions. And I don't dismiss that for sure, but for the same reasons that it's difficult locally, we shouldn't look to the state and the federal government to be the safeguard for those issues, because they in fact experience the same concerns. So I have been working steadfastly regionally, and I find that quite appealing, because once you're able to establish a regional character and a commitment to solving a problem, you don't have turnover at the regional level all at the same time. So you may be able to sustain regional progress, even if a local community goes through a change in leadership that either reverses or slows their commitment to housing policy. So I am very much a supporter of regional approaches where possible and necessary. And as I described, our region is tailor-made for it. And as we think about either federal formula funds flowing for regional initiatives, states delegating to their local communities, authorities to disperse portions of statewide trust funds, those to me are the kind of systemic approaches that can make sure we can get past some of the inherent limitations of political people making these decisions.
Jenny, I feel like Christian and I are both kind of political creatures, so I keep asking questions about politics. You, of course, are originally trained as an economist, and so I'm wondering, a bunch of the changes you've talked about, and I know you wrestled with this in some of the work you did in Massachusetts, if you go allowing even modest upzoning or ADUs, what happens to land values, both for the owners of existing properties? Do we have any data on what happens to the people who are next door to a site that might have gone from a single family house to a threeplex or a fourplex? So can you kind of walk us through the economics of this?
Yeah, so we should actually start by saying low density zoning is artificially depressing land values. By not allowing people to build anything other than a single family home, you're taking away some of the value from that land. So the way to think about upzoning is that valuable land that has been depressed, you can unlock some of the value in that property, right? And we do expect that by allowing more development, so if you can now build a duplex or a 4-story apartment building, right, that means more potential revenue to come in from that piece of land, and that increases the value of that land, assuming it's in a location where the market wants to build, right? So we could upzone cornfields in Kansas. It's not like developers are going to go build skyscrapers because the rents aren't high enough to support it, right? So the upzoning only unlocks value that was already there in high demand locations. We don't have a ton of examples of sort of large scale systematic upzoning. Arlington County, of course, did this experiment when the metro stations were built in, that they changed the zoning around the metro stations. Then I think it's a half-mile radius. It's a fairly tight boundary to allow higher density development. And if you look now, you can see that there was demand to build these tall buildings. So they had a lot of response to both commercial and residential development immediately around those stations to take advantage of the proximity to transit while keeping low density elsewhere. We really have only a handful of places that have tried to do a citywide upzoning, and we don't have a long time horizon afterwards. So I would say that's something where we don't yet have enough data to track this. We do want to make sure that local governments can capture some of that value too, so that it doesn't become just a one-time windfall for people who happen to own properties next to the commuter rail station. So a great way to do this is to have something like a TIF or another form of capturing some of the value to put back into public services and make sure that that plays into higher quality services for existing residents and not just turning into value for the landowners.
And
I don't know if you want to weigh in on this.
I could just add a dimension to this. We're a community that has tried to liberalize the ability for people to build accessory dwellings on single family lots. And we've seen, I wouldn't say an explosive growth in the number of accessory dwellings, but a significant enough number where we can draw some conclusions. And because ours is a high demand area where the demand for housing is still not anywhere close to being met with supply, particularly in areas that are zoned for single family use, we've seen no corresponding decrease in property values. In fact, it would be pretty hard to do any kind of analysis that in any way links the proximity to an accessory dwelling on housing prices. And we've also seen no diminishing of consumer demand to live in neighborhoods where they have been more apparent. So I believe one of those, it is certainly an axiom, or at least a belief that many people have, that somehow more dense occupation of a particular parcel will hurt me and diminish my property value. I would say, without a full conclusive analysis and study, that is appearing to be more of a canard than a truism.
Jenny, as the economist, do you agree with that?
Yeah, so the studies on this are often very context specific, but there's a nice strain of emerging research looking at new multifamily development in kind of large cities. So New York has had a couple of these studies. And they find that one of the benefits of building sort of a new apartment in mostly already gentrifying neighborhoods is that you actually get a little bit of softening of rents in the surrounding older buildings, right? So once there's a new shiny apartment building that all of the highest income households can move into, housing is actually a little bit cheaper around that for lower income households in these existing buildings, right? So there's sort of two things we're trying to balance. One, homeowners worry that the value of their property is going to go down if you build an apartment. And at the same time, low income neighborhoods worry about displacement, but it actually seems to work the other way around. New development helps prevent displacement in gentrifying neighborhoods. And in places where the demand is strong, building an apartment building, unlocking that value doesn't decrease the value of properties that are already there.
Jenny, your answer, I have to say that there's just an extraordinary number of wonderful questions. So I double my apology to folks that we're not going to get to, but what is the role in your mind for public housing? It's not really something you've spoken about here, and both traditional, federally or state funded public housing, and then some form of the place-based voucher system, as opposed to sort of your kind of focus on income.
Yeah. So I will say that the US has not done historically a great job with public housing, both that we have tended to cite it in low-income neighborhoods and use it to further concentrate poverty rather than to open up opportunity. Some of this is sort of the pushback. You think it's hard to build a market rate apartment in a high-income community, try building 100% public housing and see what the community is going to say. Some of this is the way that we fund public housing in this country. Congress has tended to allocate money to build it up front and not enough money to keep it going in the long run. Much of our public housing was built sort of the 1930s to 1960s, and these are buildings that need really large systems repair. As a country, we have not provided adequate funding for operations or for maintenance, let alone for capital upgrades over time. So I am skeptical that the US has gotten over its problems with doing public housing in the past, and that we would do it better in the future. There certainly are other countries where public housing or social housing, in countries like France, it's much more mixed income housing. The model has been to do this in smaller scale sometimes, to provide better funding, to have a mixture of incomes. So there are other countries that have done this very well. If the US could do social housing the way Singapore does or Vienna, I would be enthusiastic, but I don't see the evidence that we're likely to do that. And both Democratic and Republican administrations and Congresses have really said, we're going to shift to doing new development of subsidized housing through the low-income housing tax credit program, relying on nonprofit developers and for-profit developers to build, own, and manage the properties rather than public entities. And we have a rich ecosystem of affordable housing developers who do this and do it very well, with fewer restrictions than public authorities have, and without relying on Congress for constant money. So whether or not that's the ideal model if we were starting from scratch, I don't know. But I think given where we are, that's likely to be more effective. The other thing is that constructing new low-income housing is really expensive because of the way that we fund it. The tax credit program is very complicated. And I would actually like for public entities and nonprofits to look a little bit more at what we could get with acquisition of existing homes rather than new construction. The money goes farther. There are a lot of communities that have older existing apartment buildings that are in danger either of being rehabbed and becoming expensive or of falling into disuse because they're older and in poor quality. Acquisition and rehab is a great strategy in a lot of markets. It takes the subsidy farther, it brings units online faster, and potentially can also get rental housing into places where it's very hard to construct new housing. So I'd like that to be more of the focus going forward.
Chris, I don't know if you want to
Sure.
weigh in on this question.
I just say briefly, I think Jenny's got it exactly right. When we think about our community, we do public housing, not through a public housing authority, but through partnership with nonprofit and mostly nonprofit affordable housing developers who are heavily utilizing the LIHTC program. But we actually have our own local trust fund that further is part of the capital stack to make deals work, to deal with some of the inherent limitations that you have in the federal program. And, I think that's an effective hybrid model, if you will, for how to actually deal with the historic and current issues that we have with federal public housing policy. That said, I think there are other considerations that really make it work. One is a commitment to distributing it well throughout communities. As Jenny mentioned, usually siting is based in already concentrated areas of poverty, usually those, whether it be because of being bifurcated by freeways or other infrastructure, are in places that are not necessarily going to see a lot of private market investment. So without government investment that reshapes and reconnects those communities, those will just be lower opportunity areas. And if you concentrate public housing there, you're perpetuating a cycle that I'm trying to reverse. Now, well distributing it throughout your community means that it needs to be at a level of design and architecture and quality that is going to complement those communities, which can certainly make it more expensive. But to me, that is a premium price that you pay at the outset that pays for itself over the lifetime of a building. That said, you also have rehabilitation strategies that currently federal programs are not good at supporting, nor are they good at another element that I think is really critical, where possible, the availability of mixed income buildings. The LIHTC program favors 100% affordable buildings, which in dense areas like ours are not exactly the way that we can see opportunities in some key areas where we could successfully integrate mixes of incomes, but are currently needing to dig deeper into local resources to make that work because of the disfavor that the federal programs provide.
This discussion that prompts me, there are a couple of questions that have shown up in the Q&A about, and I think it's more for you, Jenny. How do we think about funding for or strategies for retrofitting existing housing, particularly kind of naturally occurring affordable housing, in not so much the Arlington counties or the Bostons, but some of the places in the Midwest and the legacy cities where there is stock, it's still affordable, but it may just not be in great shape. If you've got any thoughts on that issue.
Yeah, and I'm actually talking to you today from Philadelphia, and was just talking this morning with a number of the nonprofit developers, community development corporations that work on this. Philadelphia is one of the cities that I think has put a lot of thought into this because they have a lot of stock that is really old. It's relatively inexpensive, both rental and owner occupied. And a key focus for the city has been keeping those homes viable and in good shape so that people who are in those homes can stay there. So they have some citywide programs that will provide subsidy for basic systems maintenance. So fixing leaks and roofs and building systems and so forth. And not only that the funding is there, but that the city will actually send out workers to do this so that, for instance, low-income elderly homeowners don't have to go find themselves a contractor and hope that they're picking somebody who knows what they're doing. So I think locally funded programs like that can be very effective. Having more federal funding available, particularly for renovation of multifamily buildings, would be great. And again, the tax credit program, as Christian said, it's heavily geared towards 100% affordable, low income rather than mixed income. It's also very much tilted towards new construction rather than acquisition and rehab, although it could be used for that too. So I think the absence of money is a big piece of this. We should also think about rehab of existing buildings very much as part of a climate strategy. So most people live in existing homes, not in new construction. Boston is a great example. There are a lot of triple deckers that are not set up for climate change, and weatherization programs, window and door replacements. Building and putting in air conditioning in places that historically haven't been that hot, but are getting hotter and hotter summers, right? This is a health and safety issue with climate change, energy efficient retrofits. All of this stuff is, essentially faster and cheaper than new construction. Most people are not going to live in new construction. And so from both kind of a housing quality standpoint and a climate change standpoint, we should make this a priority for investment.
We're coming, probably have a few more questions, and just want to shift gears here a little bit. But a couple of interesting questions on how do we know what's the right number? And I think there's a couple versions of that question that I'd love to hear both of you weigh in. I mean, one is, Jenny, you showed an interesting graph at the beginning of your talk, but how would you know if we were kind of at the right point? And I think the corollary of that, and I don't know if you or Christian wants to weigh in on this, is in places like New Jersey or California, we see the state sometimes saying to localities, this is how many units. And so I'm wondering about what kind of metrics should we use in that process, and a little bit about, I got to get back to politics sooner or later, the politics of having that higher level government sort of say this is your number, and we figured it out because we figured it out. So how do we do this in terms of the calculations, not the politics?
Yeah, so I have to start with the economist's answer, which is that why do we think that governments somehow know the magic number? Do we think that governments should come up with a number of homes that should be built and then assign that? That's not typically how market economies work. The way the market knows whether we've built enough is if they build a bunch of homes and nobody wants to rent or buy them and they sit vacant. And so, we can see places where prices and rents are going up, where vacancy rates are incredibly tight, and the market is not producing more units, right? So we can see very clearly places where it's not keeping up. That said, there are a handful of states, New Jersey, California, Oregon, that do try to assign some production targets. And you can do this based on sort of population growth or projected population and job growth. There are different methods, and I don't know that anybody has figured out the right one. My leaning would be to say places that are expensive, so there's clearly high demand, that are not producing housing need to increase their supply, right? And some of this is also about building housing that's a little bit cheaper than the housing that's there. So, a community where the current median value, someplace like Palo Alto, where the median home value is like $2 million, if they build a bunch of, $500,000 condos, that would actually be a big win for affordability, right? So it's not just producing more of the most expensive housing, but producing homes that are accessible to a wider range of incomes. And so, I think that states that are trying to set targets should set things like, increasing their housing stock by a percentage over some period of time, and demonstrating that they're building homes that are cheaper than the ones that they're already there, rather than necessarily setting a single hard quantitative target.
And if you are going to do targets, you better make sure that it's based on the best information available, and often that's going to come from your local planning departments. And what we've done in the national capital area is taken the local planning departments throughout our COG and brought them in a focus study to really refine our population and household growth projections moving forward. And so as we looked at our most recent round of projection refinements that targeted the year 2030, we identified a clear gap between the number of units we expect to need versus what will be produced based on current planning entitlements. So we set regional targets that substantially upped what we needed to do by a factor of 320,000 units across the national capital area. And that was a necessary exercise that fortunately we adopted enthusiastically, that has given people something to plan for. And I agree wholeheartedly with Jenny. You'll know if you miss the mark by what happens at the end of it, but there's little doubt, or there's little fear that will happen in this area, which has been far not delivering the units based on demand for the last several decades. So it's not a risk for areas like ours. I recognize that other communities may be facing a different economic scenario, but in high growth, high demand, and already unaffordable areas, that by no means should prevent people from moving forward, fearing that they're going to end up with an oversupply of housing.
And I will say one caution is that often the projections are based on past population growth, right? So places that have been growing quickly are expected to continue growing quickly. And I worry a little bit that places that have been very effective in stymieing growth because they haven't built housing in the past then get let off the hook, right? So much of the wealthy communities in California are actually losing population because nobody can afford to live there. The fact that they haven't been growing for the last 10 years doesn't mean that they shouldn't be building more housing. Many times those are exactly the places that ought to be building the most.
I was wondering, Kristen, I was part of an advisory group for the MAPC, the regional planning agency here in Boston. And part of the interesting discussion was not only what's the number, but then how, at least even on a target basis, are we going to allocate that within the region? So to Jenny's point, we could say, we're going to grow by this, but it's all going to be out in the exurbs. And that started to be a pretty interesting conversation. I'm guessing you've had a similar one, and this goes back to Jenny's point about, are we building in the right places?
Absolutely. Yeah, we've of course had that exercise, but one of the things that I'm most proud of that we did as a region, we really refined and didn't just do future projections based on past performance, but where do we expect the jobs to be? And therefore, where are the jurisdictions that are going to be, either because of proximity or transit connectivity, most useful to house the workers that are going to be employed in those jobs? And let's figure out the allocation within our jurisdictions about where that housing deficit should be filled. So we've got the responsibility coming from urban core jurisdictions like ours, and we're not just pushing it out on the exurbs, because we also have co-occurring goals for high capacity transit areas to really be the backbone for activity centers where we want people to live and work. And we also have climate change and sustainability goals. So if I push them all out to the exurbs, I'm really counteracting those other priorities. So we've got a distribution that I believe responsibly allocates the targets to all jurisdictions based on where we want the housing to be.
I'll just put a flag down to say there were a bunch of questions about the connections between transportation planning and housing that we haven't gotten to, but you've
all
touched
connected.
On. Jenny
if you try to disaggregate them, you do it to your peril.
When Marcia Fudge spoke at the Graduate School of Design a couple of weeks ago, Gerald Caden, who moderated, said he was going to ask her if she'd rather be Secretary of HUD or Secretary of DOT. but he decided not to. Let me wrap
actually,
up.
let me jump in there to because we actually haven't talked that much about kind of what the federal government could do to encourage this, right? We talked a little bit about the states and the COGS. The federal government has less direct authority over land use than states. So the federal government can't preempt local governments from building apartment buildings, which states in theory could. It does have, of course, the power of the purse, and the federal government does distribute lots of funding, both to states and then to local governments. One of the hard things about trying to do this out of the housing side of budget is that HUD's budget is nowhere near as big as Department of Transportation's. And HUD's budget has tended to go mostly to larger urban areas, some of whom should be building more housing, but they're not really the worst offenders, right? So HUD doesn't give that much money directly to rich suburbs. But the Department of Transportation does do a lot of redistribution. And the new federal infrastructure bill has a bunch of kind of discretionary pots of money where local governments can apply for it. And they're hoping to use that to encourage more housing development around transit, around jobs, to encourage better integration. So I think to the extent that at the federal level, HUD and DOT are on the same page and using their discretionary funds to encourage sort of joint planning on the local level, that's one lever to push. And I'll be curious to see, these are still kind of early stages of writing the regulations, but for local governments who are thinking about how do I get a crack at the federal money, if you've got your ducks in a row and you're planning to use this money well from a climate perspective and a transit perspective, that's likely to sit better with the competitive grants.
Both the specifics are right, and of course there's a good chunk of the book, as you highlighted in the talk, about things that the federal government could do, some of which again are quite ambitious. I do want to ask one last question on the federal government, Jenny, which is, there are a couple of questions here about the mortgage interest deduction, which has been hotly debated, but what do we know with the tax changes of a couple of years ago and the increase in the standard deduction? What do we know about who's using and who's benefiting from the mortgage interest deduction at this point?
Yeah, so the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 doubled the standard deduction. And so most kind of moderate and middle income homeowners now just take the standard deduction rather than itemizing. And it also brought down the cap on the mortgage interest deduction from $1 million to $750,000. I think that piece is really useful because the real estate industry has been telling us for a long time, if you lower the cap on mortgages that can be deducted, you're going to crash the housing market. And it turns out that did not happen. So we could feel comfortable lowering it a little bit further, say to $500,000 instead. But effectively what the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did was make this a program that is exclusively for wealthy homeowners with expensive homes and big mortgages. And this is about as regressive a policy as you can possibly come up with, right? So we're rewarding people who've already bought big, expensive homes. This is not getting them into first-time home ownership. It's just rewarding them for something they've already bought. And we're spending a bunch of money on people who would be homeowners anyway, which we could be spending, say, on vouchers for low-income households. So to me, the fact that it's become more regressive and less effectively targeted is a really good argument to ditch it altogether.
Kristen, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. Okay. We've come to the end of our time. I wanted to ask you both about places you would look at. Actually, let's take another minute. Where is there any place that you think is doing a better job at getting this right, or what are the places you're watching right now to sort of see the most interesting kind of changes? Sort of maybe do a kind of lightning. Why don't we start, Christian, you, and then Jenny.
Well, we are trying to comprehensively up our game, so we're borrowing from everywhere, looking at zoning reforms. Of course, Minneapolis is the great poster child for this. As we look at also figuring out how to look at how to bring public housing to a much better place. We're looking at communities up and down the East Coast, including Philadelphia, New York, and even as part of our core Washington, D.C. So I would say that we don't have really a perfect analog that we're trying to model, but we're really trying to develop our comprehensive approach by looking at the best practices for those who have had success in individual housing policy areas.
And I'm going to take a very wide angle lens and say that the US could learn from looking at other countries, because we often get sort of really different institutions and systems. So Japan is doing a fantastic job on housing production. They have much more flexible land use. So they, cities like Tokyo, you can have a small single family house and an apartment building right next to each other. The zoning is much more flexible in allowing development. Japan has very high levels of housing production. And so even though Tokyo is a mega metropolitan area, it is much, much more affordable than equivalent cities in the US. Western Europe, I think, is a good example to think about how to provide more housing support as part of the social safety net. So countries like Germany and France, every low-income household gets a housing subsidy. It is not limited by the budget assigned by Congress. It's just an entitlement. If you're poor and you need help paying the rent, the federal government is going to provide you support. So I think that we can learn a lot from what other countries are doing. And the more that we see good examples, try to tweak them and figure out how they can work in our system.
Well, usually when I end these talks, I try and come up with, 3 great takeaways, and I'm sort of scrambling right in my head. But in this marvelous book, Jenny, sort of towards the end, I think really sums up the conversation. She says, these are not just technical problems for city planners and real estate developers or theoretical conundrums for academics. Fundamentally, they are political issues that weigh up competing claims between different constituencies, including thorny questions about whether some people's financial interests or aesthetic preferences matter more than other people's access to basic shelter. It's another wonderful example. This is a terrific book. It's spurred a terrific conversation. It appears, Zoom is telling me, you've got more than 100 questions and an extraordinary turnout. Jenny, thank you for spurring the conversation. Christian, thank you for bringing the real world, making sure that Jenny and I didn't just have interesting theoretical conundrums to go over. To all of you, thank you for joining us. And I look forward to seeing some of you in person and other people online as we move forward. Thank you very, very much. And everybody have a great day.
Thank you.